Well, I'd like to, in these two talks, I'd like to talk about some foundational issues, in particular what the most important ones, I think, namely, what are the fundamental computational operations that enter into constructing syntactic objects, and why these and not other ones. It turns out there's quite a lot to say about that since the last time I talked here. Many problems, some solutions. I'll get to this in the course of the discussion as far as I can. But I think it would be useful to begin with a couple of comments on something more general, namely, what are we trying to achieve altogether in studying language? Many different ways of looking at it. These questions, I think, are in many ways more important than the particular technical results. They raise many questions about what is an authentic, genuine explanation, a genuine solution, and what is a maybe very valuable reorganization of data, posing of problems, often posing a solution, but not really achieving it. These things are worth thinking through, I think. The basic issues were formulated, I think, for the first time, quite perceptively at the outset of the scientific revolution in the 17th century. Galileo and his contemporaries, who were raising all sorts of questions about received wisdom, turned their attention to language as well. And they expressed their awe and amazement at the miraculous fact that with a couple of dozen sounds, it was somehow possible to express an infinite number of thoughts and to find ways to convey to others who have no access to our minds, everything that's going on in our minds. So in their own words, which I rather like, I'll quote, they were awed by the method by which we are able to express our thoughts, the marvelous invention by which, using 25 or 30 sounds, we can create the infinite variety of expressions which, having nothing themselves in common with what is passing in our minds, nonetheless permit us to express all our secrets and allow us to understand what is not present to consciousness, in fact, everything we can conceive and the most diverse movements of our soul. Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most stupendous of human inventions because it had these amazing properties, and also because, as he put it, it allowed us to express all the wisdom of the ages, and it contained within it the answers to any questions that we might pose, kind of like a universal Turing machine in our terms. The Port Royal Grammar and Logic, actually, which I was just quoting, a paraphrase of Galileo, had many insights into logic and linguistics. It's in many ways the basis of modern logic. There was a rich tradition that developed exploring what was called rational and universal grammar. Rational because it was supposed to provide explanations. Universal because it was concerned with what was taken to be common to the common human possession of language. Was seeking explanations, including descriptions of even the vernacular, which was quite surprising at the time, innovative, but mainly explanations, and universal, trying to find what's common to all languages. This tradition went on for a couple of centuries, many contributions. The last representative of it, about a century ago, was Otto Jespersen. As he put it, his concern was how the elements of language come into existence in the mind of a speaker on the basis of finite experience, yielding a notion of structure that is definite enough to guide him in framing sentences of his own, crucially free expressions that are typically new to speaker and hearer, and also beyond that to find the great principles that underlie the grammars of all languages. Now, I think it's fair to you have to interpret that tradition is metaphoric, often vague, but I think it's fair to extricate from it the recognition that language is, the capacity for language, as well as individual languages, are possessions of individual persons. They're part of a person. They're shared. It was recognized throughout the species without significant variation, and recognized to be unique to humans in fundamental respects. That general program falls within the natural sciences, within what these days is called the biolinguistic program. Of course, it ran into many difficulties, conceptual difficulties, empirical difficulties. The evidence was pretty thin, and nobody really understood how to capture the notion, Jesperson's notion of structure in the mind. What is that? That enables us to develop, construct in our minds infinitely many expressions, and even to find a way to convey to others what's going on in our mind. That's what we call the Galilean challenge, which is still extant. Well, all of this was swept aside in the 20th century by structuralist, behaviorist currents, which very typically adopted a very different approach to language, taking the object of study not to be something internal to the person, but some outside thing. So maybe a corpus, an infinite set of utterances, some other external formulation. And you see this very clearly if you simply look at the definitions of language that were given through the early 20th century by the leading figures. So, for example, for de Saussure, a language is a kind of social contract. It's a collection, as he put, a collection of word images in the community of speakers. For Leonard Bloomfield, its language is the utterances that can be made in a particular speech community. For Harris, it's the distribution of morphemes in a set of sentences. For if you move to philosophy of language, say Van Quine, a language is, as he put it, I'm quoting, a fabric of sentences associated with one another and with stimuli by the mechanism of conditioned response. Elsewhere, an infinite set of sentences. David Lewis, language and languages, also took just languages. A language is some set of sentences, which is infinite. Both Quine and Lewis crucially argued that it makes sense to talk about an infinite set of sentences, but not of a particular way of generating them, which is a very strange notion if you think about it, because, and these are the leading logicians and philosophers, you can't talk about an infinite set in any coherent fashion unless you have some characterization of what's in it and what's not in it. Otherwise, you're not saying anything. But the behaviorist, the pressure of behaviorist beliefs was so powerful that the idea that there could be a privileged way of generating that infinite set was, as Quine put it, folly. Lewis put it, something unintelligible. But whatever any of these entities are, they're outside the individual. The tradition was completely forgotten. People like Jesperson, the last representative, were literally unknown. There's good review of this by a historian of linguistics, Julia Falk, who runs through the way Jesperson was disappeared in the first half of the 20th century, and the whole tradition way back also. In fact, to this day, even linguistics historical scholarship, which is pretty thin. It barely recognizes any of the things I've mentioned. Well, so returning to the forgotten tradition, by the mid-20th century, there were clear ways of capturing the concept, notion of structure in the mind, Jesperson's concept. Turing, other great mathematicians, had established the tools for addressing the Galilean challenge, something you're all, I'm sure, familiar with. So Jesperson's notion of structure becomes what's now called the I language, the internal generative system, finite system that determines an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions that express thoughts insofar as they can be expressed linguistically, and it can be externalized in sensory motor systems, typically, though we know, not necessarily sound. We can call this the basic property of language. Well, to meet the Galilean challenge, there are several tasks that have to be undertaken. The main one, of course, is to try to determine the internal languages, the I languages of speakers of typologically varied languages, a huge task. Then the question comes of how a speaker selects a particular expression from the internal I language. Then how the expression, once selected, is externalized, and the inverse, how the externalization is internalized by the hearer. The last two tasks are both input-output systems. We kind of grasp how to study those, and quite a lot has been learned about it over the years. The first of them, how the speaker selects a syntactic object out of the infinite array, that's a total mystery. There's nothing to say about it. That's true of voluntary behavior generally. So actually here at MIT, two of the leading specialists on the neuroscience of voluntary action, Emilio Bizzi, Robert Ajamian, about a year ago, wrote a kind of state-of-the-art article in which they discussed what they know about voluntary motion, simple, not language, simple things like lifting your finger, you know. And they said, well, they put it, as they said, fancifully, that we're beginning to learn about the puppet and the strings, but we can't say anything at all about the puppeteer. So how you select what you're going to do remains the kind of question that you can't even pose intelligibly in the sciences at this stage here as well. Well, the I language, keeping to the tradition, is a property of the individual, and also the species-specific faculty of language, also an internal property, something which allows the I language to be acquired. And it has to meet a couple of empirical conditions, two conditions which are kind of conflicting. The conditions of learnability and the conditions of evolvability. So whatever the faculty of language is, it's got to be rich enough so that possessing it, a child can acquire the I language from the scattered and limited data available, and it is scattered and limited, and it has to achieve the internal system which has all of these rich and complex consequences. So it has to be that rich, but it also has to be simple enough so that it could have evolved. And now we can be a little more specific about that because some of the conditions of evolution of language are coming to light, and I'll talk about it later if there's time, and the evolution has to meet those empirical conditions. Well, those are the conditions for a genuine explanation. If some proposed descriptive device satisfies these conditions, then it's the basis for an explanation for addressing the Galilean challenge as it was formulated and developed in the tradition of rational and universal grammar. The general explanation is always at the level of UG, the theory of the faculty of language, and it has to offer some prospects of satisfying the conditions of learnability and evolvability. That's a pretty austere requirement, very austere requirement, but it's the right requirement. Anything short of that is short of actually explaining things. It's maybe very valuable, maybe organizing problems in an interesting way, can move on from there, but still falls short of general explanation. We can now, I think, grasp somewhat more clearly what actually is a genuine explanation, something that was really not possible in earlier stages of linguistic inquiry. Again, any device that's introduced to account for something, unless it can meet these dual conditions, is short of explanation, may be very valuable. So many examples. Take a concrete example to illustrate about something I'll come back to later if there's time. Interesting paper by Željko Bosković, who you all know, on the coordinate structure and adjunct island constraints. And what he points out is that each of these constraints poses many problems, many mysteries, but his paper is an effort to try to reduce the mysteries by reducing both constraints to the same constraint, using the device of Neo-Davidsonian event semantics, which interprets a junction as a kind of coordination. So you can reduce both of the problems to the same problem, coordination, and then we still have the mysteries, but now a simpler problem, one set of mysteries instead of two independent ones. It tries to show that the problems then reduce in this way. Well, that's a step forward. It leaves the mysteries in a better position for productive inquiry, but it's not an explanation. He's quite clear about that. And I think if you look over the field, that virtually every achievement, everyone, is a partial step forward in this respect. There's very few exceptions, just barely coming to light, which I think can count as genuine explanations. They're important in themselves, and they're also a kind of a sort of a guideline into how we should think about proceeding. And they may also tell us something about just how far it's possible to go. It's not so obvious. You can go much beyond what the kinds of explanations that are now beginning to come to light. I'll talk about that. Actually, the earliest work in generative grammar tried to meet even more austere conditions. Was heavily influenced by work of people like Nelson Goodman and W.V. Quine, who were working on what they called constructive nominalism. No sets, very austere, just mereological concepts of a very limited kind. That was too austere, at least for the present. Couldn't get very far that way. There are several papers about it. So that was kind of dropped, at least for the present. Maybe you can come back to it someday. And attention turned to something else, namely the vast range of empirical data from all kinds of languages that was beginning to appear as soon as the first efforts were made to write actual generative grammars. Turned out that everything was puzzling and complex, and nothing was understood. It was just massive puzzles. Big change from a few years earlier, during the period of structural linguistics. It was basically assumed that everything was known. Everything was solved. We had the methods of analysis. You could formalize them. All that was needed was to just apply them to one or another language. That turned out to be radically false. Well, the first proposals, as you all know, were dual. There were operations to deal with the problem of compositionality, phrase structure grammar, and totally different operations to deal with the phenomenon of dislocation, ubiquitous phenomenon, transformational grammar. Both systems were far too complex to meet the long-term goals of genuine explanation. That was well understood. The general assumption at the time, remaining for a long time, often up until today, is that the principles of compositionality are natural. You can expect those, something like phrase structure grammar, but that dislocation is a weird property that languages have, a kind of imperfection that we have to somehow, languages for some reason have this. Formal languages would never be constructed with that property. And that is still a widely held view. I think it's exactly the opposite of the truth. The opposite, I think, turns out to be true, that more recent work suggests that dislocation is a kind of the null hypothesis. It's what's expected on the simplest grounds, and it's the most primitive of operations. I'll come back to that. But let me just take a brief look at the steps that were taken to reach what I think is this conclusion. Well, in the 60s, phrase structure grammars were basically eliminated. Phrase structure grammar is far too rich to be contemplated as relevant to describing languages. So there's nothing in phrase structure, the theory of phrase structure grammar, that prevents you, say, from having a rule, VP arrow NCP, let's say. Fine phrase structure rule. Doesn't make any sense. It was just assumed you just can't do that sort of thing. But the right theory has to rule that out as unacceptable. And that step was taken by the late 60s, basically led to X-bar theory. X-bar theory had interesting consequences, which weren't really fully appreciated at the time. They're obvious in retrospect. For one thing, X-bar theory, notice, has no linear order. So Japanese and English, say, roughly mirror images, have about the same X-bar theory. Linear orders on the side somewhere. That was a step towards something which I think is now much clearer, namely that the surface order of expressions is not strictly speaking part of language. It's something else. I'll come back to that. But if you just look at X-bar theory, it's already a step in that direction. Another thing about X-bar theory is it forces a theory of parameters. So Japanese and English, say, differ, and they're going to differ in some choice that is not determined by X-bar theory. So the speaker and the hearer who's using a linear system of externalization, you don't have to use that. But if you are using it, you're going to have to make a choice as to the order in which you're going to externalize the internal system. So X-bar theory itself first is a step towards separating a linear order and other surface organization from what we might think of as core I language, the I language that's dealing with the Galilean challenge, constructing the set of linguistically articulated thoughts, putting externalization in some medium to the side. And I think that picture is becoming clearer. We'll come back to that. Well, there are also, along with the clear progress of X-bar theory, there were very serious problems which weren't recognized at the time. The main problem is it excludes the possibility of exocentric constructions. Everything has to be endocentric in X-bar theory. And that's just false. There are exocentric constructions all over the place. simple things like subject-predicate, or for that matter, every case of dislocation without exception, except for head movement. All of these give you exocentric constructions. There's no way to describe them in X-bar theory. Now, in order to describe them, many artifices were developed. So, for example, if you have a subject-predicate construction, maybe it was called a TP or an IP or something like it, or a VP. But that's just stipulation. You could just as well call it an NP, let's say. And this runs all the way through the descriptive apparatus. So there was a serious problem, not really recognized till a couple of years ago. My own feeling is it's pretty much overcome by labeling theory, which tells you in a principled way in terms of minimal search, a simple computational principle, when it is, when movement, internal merge may take place, when it must take place, when it need not take place. And there are many interesting results and plenty of interesting problems about this, a lot of very intriguing material, most of which I presume you're familiar with. Well, by moving up to the 1990s, it did seem to a number of us that enough had been learned, so it might be possible for the first time to confront the problem of genuine explanation. That's what's called the minimalist program. Pursuing that program, if you want a genuine explanation, you want to start with computational operations which meet the conditions of learnability and evolvability. Well, the easiest way to meet the condition of learnability is to say that learnability is zero. It's just innate, nothing to say about it. And the easiest way to meet the condition of evolvability would be to say, let's find a computational principle that had to evolve. There was no way for it not to have evolved. Well, if you look at those two conditions, they're satisfied by the most elementary computational operation, what's been called merge in recent years, which incidentally has many problems that I'll come back to, but basically just the operation of a binary set formation. It has to be there because the basic property exists, okay? And that means at the very least, the simplest operation must exist. Maybe more complex ones, but at least the simplest one. So we know that it has to exist, had to have evolved. So it meets the condition of evolvability. That leaves the question of just how it happened and what the neurological implication is, but whatever the answers to those, this is an operation that had to evolve. And having evolved, it's innate, so it meets the condition of learnability. So if you can reduce something to that, you do have a genuine explanation. That's as far as it's possible to go, okay? If you can't go that far, it's a description. It's not a genuine explanation. Again, this is a pretty austere requirement, but I think it's the one we ought to have in mind when we're thinking about the goals of our efforts in inquiring into language. Well, so I won't give the details because I think you're familiar with them, but the simplest computational operation then, merge, binary set formation, meeting the no tampering condition, least possible computation, you don't modify the elements, don't add any more structure. Interesting things to say about this, to which I'll come back. There is a good deal of current literature which tries to show that you can reach this operation in steps. That's incoherent. You can't have partial binary set formation. You can't reach it in steps. It's you either have it or you don't have it. There's nothing simpler. Again, lots of literature about this, but it's just beside the point. There's actually a interesting recent paper by Rini Hoybrechts analyzing some of the recent proposals and showing why they don't make any sense. But if you think about it, they can't make sense. The simplest case of merge is going to have at least, maybe at most we would like to show, but at least two cases. One of them, external merge, when you're taking separate things and forming the set. One, internal merge, when you're taking one thing and something inside it, forming the set of those. Those are at least the two simplest possibilities. Notice there are only one operation. There's no two operations, just one operation with two cases. Much confusion about this in the literature, but that should be obvious if you think it through. Notice that this whole program is a program. It's not a theory. The program is to see how far can we go if we take the simplest possible operation and try to give genuine explanations in terms of it. Maybe that's impossible. Maybe you have to find more complex operations. But in that case, it's going to be necessary to demonstrate how they can be acquired, how they can be learned, and how they could have evolved. And that's not so trivial. You can't just say, well, natural selection does anything I like. That's not an explanation. You have to give a real explanation. Very difficult in biology. It's in the biological literature, it's pointed out that it's fiendishly difficult, standard phrase, to give an account of the evolution of almost any trait, even the simplest ones, like having blue eyes, for example. And it's not the kind of thing you can hand wave about. So either you can try to meet that condition or recognize that you don't have genuine explanations. Well, there have been, I think, substantial achievements in the last recent years in trying to gain genuine explanations. They do have problems. I want to return to the problems later, but I'll put them on the shelf for a moment. One achievement, which is not trivial, is to unify the two traditional kinds of operations, compositionality and dislocation. They are unified once you keep to the simplest computational operation. So far from being an imperfection, as was always assumed by me in particular, it would take a stipulation to bar dislocation. If you have no stipulations at all, you get dislocation. Furthermore, as I mentioned before, that's arguably the simplest case of merge. If you want, actually, you can't have only one and not the other, because once you have merge, you have both. But if you're looking for one that's more primitive, it's probably internal merge. The reasons for that are quite straightforward. External merge requires enormous search. To put two things together that are separate, first of all, you have to search the entire lexicon. Then you have to search everything that's already been constructed and maybe is sitting there somewhere waiting to be merged. With internal merge, you have almost no search at all. So one reason for regarding internal merge dislocation as more primitive, it requires a tiny fraction of the search. But there's a good deal more than that. There's some interesting suggestions in the literature. They're not definitive, but they're suggestive. So one was some work that was done by Marv Minsky a couple of decades ago. He and one of his students just explored what would happen if you took the simplest Turing machines, smallest number of states, smallest number of symbols, and just let them run free and see what happens. What turned out was kind of interesting. Most of them crashed, either got into infinite loops or just stopped. But the ones that didn't crash, all of them gave the successor function. Now, what's the successor function? Well, one thing the successor function is internal merge. So if you take a merge and you have a one-member lexicon, just run 3, get the successor function. Minsky's argument at the time was that probably evolution, in the course of evolution, nature found the simplest thing. That's what you'd expect. So it found the successor function. And that happens to be internal merge, not external merge. If you look at other organisms, way down to the level of insects, they count. So an ant, say, can count the number of steps it's taken. It's got a counter, maybe a set of counters inside. And if you look at just the mathematics of successive counters, they kind of tend towards the successor function. It doesn't take a big step to move them up to the successor function. So from various points of view, it seems plausible to think that of the core operations, the most primitive one is actually dislocation, contrary to what was always thought. And as you get richer constructions, you have external merge, and it gives you richer kinds of languages. We plainly have it in natural language. It's not just internal merge. And interesting question is why. It probably has to do with argument structure, which is uniquely related to external merge. I'll come back to that. Well, with the unification of internal and external merge, compositionality and dislocation, what was suggested by X-bar theory, as I mentioned before, becomes much more clear and explicit. So it seems that the generation of the CI interface, sometimes called LF, what gets semantically interpreted, the linguistically articulated thoughts, that's we can call core I language, and that just keeps the structure. No linear order, no other kinds of arrangements. So why is there linear order in spoken language? Incidentally, not strictly in sign language. So in sign language, which we know to be essentially equivalent to spoken language, there's different dimensionality. So you can use visual space. You can use simultaneous operations, facial gestures and motions. So it's not strictly linear. It makes use of the contingencies allowed by the space that's of externalization. But speech happens to be linear. You have to string words one after another. So if you pick that particular modality of externalization, yes, you're going to have linear order. But does linear order have anything to do with language? Well, depends what you think you want to call language. But what it really has to do with is an amalgam of two totally different independent systems. One of them, internal language, the other, a particularly sensory motor system, which has absolutely nothing to do with language. The sensory motor systems were around hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years before language ever appeared. And they don't seem to have been affected by language. At most, there's very minor suggestions about slight adaptations that might have taken place for, say, changes of the alveolar ridge in click languages. There's some very small things, but basically the sensory motor systems seem independent of language. But if you do externalize the internal system through this filter, you're going to get linear order. But strictly speaking, that's a property of an amalgam of two independent systems. And in fact, that's true of externalization altogether. And notice that externalization poses a hard problem. You have two completely independent systems. They have nothing to do with one another. You have to match them somehow. You can expect that process to be pretty complex and also to be variable. You can do it in many different ways. Also to be easily mutable, can change from one generation to another under slight effects. Putting all these expectations together, what is a natural expectation, and I think it increasingly is coming to be imaginable, maybe true, is that the variety and complexity and mutability of language is basically a property of externalization, not a property of language itself. And it could turn out to be true. It's a goal at the moment that the core I language is really unique, may not vary from language to language. Actually, that much is pretty much tacitly assumed in essentially all the work on formal semantics and pragmatics. It's not assumed to be parameterized from one language to another or to be learned somehow. It's just there, which means if we ever understand it properly, it'll be reducible to elementary computations which just don't vary. That's the way the internal system works. That should be the goal of inquiry in those directions. I should say, just as a terminological point, what's called formal semantics is actually a form of syntax. It's symbolic manipulation. Technically, something becomes semantics when you relate it to the external world, and that's a tricky business. Even things like, say, event calculus, if you think about it, events are really mental constructions. You can't find them in the outside world. You construct them there. And the task of relating what's internal to the external world, dealing with questions of reference, is no trivial matter. A lot to say about this, but I'll put it aside. But it seems to me we can see a goal for all of this work to try to reduce it to computational operations that do meet the conditions of genuine explanation. Again, a very austere criterion, but I think one that's worth keeping in mind. Well, these are all possibilities that I think are looking increasingly plausible. The field may go in that direction. Be very striking discovery if it really does. Well, let's go on with genuine explanations. One of them is dislocation, putting it together with compositionality. And notice that that includes automatically the basis for what's called reconstruction. You keep to the no tampering condition, you automatically get what's called the copy theory of movement. That's the basis for the complex properties of reconstruction. There's a lot to look into, but that's essentially the basis for it. You don't need rules of reconstruction. They're just there. That's automatic. Well, of genuine explanations, the most interesting case, I think, is the old principle of structure dependence. This was discovered back in the 1950s. This is a really strange principle of language which had never been noticed, namely that the rules and operations of language, the ones that yield interpretation of sentences, don't pay any attention to linear order. They just deal with structures, which is extremely puzzling when you think about it, because linear order is what you hear. It's 100% of what you hear. You never hear structure. Furthermore, at least superficially, it seems that computations on linear order are simpler than computations on structure. From another point of view, that turns out to be false, but at least superficially, that looks right. So what it seems, and what always seemed extremely puzzling, is that the rules that the syntactic rules and the rules that yield semantic interpretations don't pay any attention to 100% of what you hear and to the simplest operations, which is a pretty puzzling fact. And we now have a simple explanation for it. It follows from the simplest computational operation. If the entire internal language is based on the computation of the simplest merge operation in its simplest form, then you automatically get structure dependence for operations of movement, of construal, of interpretation, of everything else. I won't run through examples. I assume you're familiar with them, but that just seems to be a fact about all constructions in all languages. That, if it's correct, is a genuine explanation of a fundamental property of language, maybe the deepest property of language, that the core language just doesn't care about order and arrangement, it only cares about structure. And a child learning language just ignores everything they hear. By now, there's interesting independent evidence supporting this conclusion. So for studies of language acquisition, which have proceeded in very sophisticated ways by now, have now gotten down to the point where 30-month-old infants have been shown already to observe the principle of structure dependence. That's almost no data, remember, and it's a very abstract principle. There's other work by, earlier work by Steve Crane, Nakamura, who've got a lot of evidence that 3-year-olds have mastered it, but recent studies have it down to 30 months. If we have better studies, which as they keep improving, it'll probably be earlier. What that means is you're just born with it. So it meets the condition of learnability, namely 0, and it has the condition of evolvability. You have to have this particular operation at least, maybe more, but at least this one, because you do have the basic principle. Well, there's also, as many of you know, neurolinguistic evidence. The studies inspired by Andrea Moro of a group in Milan, Musso and others have shown, many of you know this, that if you present subjects with invented systems of 2 types, one which correspond to the rules of an actual language that the subjects don't know, the other which uses things like linear order, you get different kinds of brain activity. In the case of, say, having a negation be the 3rd word in the sentence, very trivial operation, you get diffuse brain activity. If you follow what look like more complex rules of actual languages, you get activity in the expected brain language-specific areas, the brain, Broca's area, and so on. That's been by now replicated many times. It looks like a pretty solid result. There's also psycholinguistic evidence of other kinds. The Moro-Musso experiments were actually suggested by work of Neil Smith and Ianthe Tsimple on a subject who they've been working with for many years, a young man they call Chris, who has extremely limited cognitive capacities, almost none, but tremendous linguistic capacities. He picks up languages like Ken Hale. You know what that means. Like a sponge, in other words, just picks them up immediately. And Neil Smith tried these same experiments before the neuro-linguistic ones were done. He just tried it with Chris, and turned out when you gave Chris a nonsense language modeled on an actual language, he learned it easily, like every other language. When they gave him the very simple language, things like negation being the 3rd word, he couldn't handle it at all. It was just a puzzle. He can't deal with puzzles. You know? That's what inspired the neurolinguistic studies. I think those are the most interesting discoveries so far in the brain sciences related to language. It's a direction in which other experimental work could go. Well, looking back at this, it seems to be one of these very rare cases where you have converging evidence from every direction leading to the same conclusion, that core I language just is independent of linear order and other arrangements. You have linguistic evidence, psycholinguistic evidence, neurolinguistic evidence, evolutionary considerations, anything you can think about. Now, there's a very curious fact. There's a huge literature in computational cognitive science trying to show that somehow this principle can be learned, which is a very weird fact if you look at it. It's like trying to find a complicated way to disprove the null hypothesis. Things like that just don't happen in the sciences. I mean, here you have the absolute optimal explanation and a huge literature trying to show, look, there's a very complicated way in which maybe we can reach the same conclusion. It's an enterprise that's kind of senseless at the base of it. Of course, when you look at the actual cases, never works. It's not going to work. If it did work, it would be meaningless because it's always asking the wrong question. I mean, suppose you could show that by a detailed, statistical analysis with recurrent neural networks and so on of many layers of, say, the Wall Street Journal, you could find evidence that a child might have used at 30 months old to discover that you have structure dependence. You're not going to find that, of course, but even though there's literature claiming it. But if you did find it, it would be completely meaningless. Because the only question is, why is this the case? Why is it that in every language and every construction, this is the way it works? If you could find a way of showing, well, here's how it might work in this language, it tells you nothing. It's answering the wrong question. And furthermore, as I say, it's trying to find a complicated way to disprove the null hypothesis. The whole enterprise is completely senseless. It's actually probably the major effort in computational cognitive science to try to find a basis for some linguistic principle. Huge literature on it. New papers still coming out. A very strange thing. Papers trying to show that, as it's the way they put it, often you can get structure dependence without what's sometimes called an inductive bias for structure dependence. But there's no inductive bias. It's just the null hypothesis. Make no assumptions. This is what you get. There's no bias. It's just given, So I think an interesting question about, there are many interesting questions about how linguistics is done, but one of them is why things like this go on. I think it's worth thinking about. Well, there are other successes, but what I'd like to do is turn to problems. There are a lot of problems about merge, and there are some paths to solution. So one problem is what I already mentioned, exocentric constructions. So take, say, NP-VP. Let's assume, since Dominique is here, let's, in his honor, assume the predicate internal subject hypothesis. Okay. So you put together a subject and an NP and a VP. The NPs are often called DPs. I'll come back to that. I think that's probably a mistake. Let's just call them noun phrases for the moment. You have a noun phrase and a verb phrase. You put them together. That gives you the basic theta structure. Well, the noun phrase and the verb phrase have to be independently constructed, which means you have to have some kind of workspace, something that Jonathan's pointed out years ago. You have to have some kind of workspace in which you're constructing these separate things. And if you think it through, the workspace can proliferate, not indefinitely, but can get larger, where you're just doing parallel things and putting them together. So it means that the operation merge really ought to be revised to become an operation on workspaces, not on two elements, X and Y. It's an operation which changes a workspace to another workspace. And then the question comes how it does it. Well, I should say I'm very pleased to be back at a nice low-tech institution like MIT with blackboards and no PowerPoint and no projections and any of that stuff, which they have in Arizona. Where? Here. So what we want is some kind of operation that says, let's call it capital merge. We'll look at its properties. Which takes two things, call them P and Q, the guys we're going to merge, and a workspace, and turns it into some other workspace. So what's the other workspace? Well, it's going to include the set PQ, the two guys we're putting together. In fact, let me use a different notation for reasons I'll mention. For a workspace is a set, but we want to distinguish it from the syntactic objects, which are sets. So a workspace doesn't merge with something. So just for convenience, just use a different notation. So the new thing will include the set PQ and a lot of other junk. And the next question is, what's the other junk in the workspace? Now, that turns out to be not a trivial question. It turns out a lot turns on what the answer is. So let's take the simplest case, okay? The entire workspace consists of two elements. I'll call them A and B. That's the workspace. And suppose we decide to merge them. So we get the new workspace, which includes the set AB. And does it include anything else? So for example, does it include A and B? Well, if we think about the way recursion generally works, it should include A and B. So if you're doing, say, proof theory, okay, you're generating a proof. You construct a line from axioms and former things, and you can go back to that line if you like. You can always go back to anything you've produced already for the next step. But there's a good reason to believe that for organisms, and particularly humans, it doesn't work that way. And you can see that if you think what would happen if you did allow this to happen. Okay, suppose you allow this. Then you could go on to construct some much bigger object here, including AB as a term, but it could be of arbitrary complexity, you know, any kind of complexity you like. And then you could take A and merge it with it and get XA, but then A would be up here and A would be down there, and there are two copies, and they would violate every imaginable constraint on movement, okay? So if you allow this, you're going to get total chaos. Every constraint on dislocation will be violated, no matter how radical you make the violation. Well, that tells us something. It tells us something kind of surprising, and I think significant, that the kind of recursion that takes place in human language, and probably organic systems generally, cuts back the set of items accessible to computation as narrowly as possible, okay? Let's give it a name and call it resource restriction. RR for simplicity. It looks as though a very general, this is merely the first example. If you think it through, it works for millions of things. The same model of refutation eliminates a whole set of possible extensions of merge that have been proposed over the years. I'll come back to examples. But you notice what the problem is. The problem is that if you allow the normal kind of recursion, no constraints, no limits, then you're going to find that by legitimate means, you can get illegitimate objects. Now that has to be barred, right? You can generate all kind of deviant expressions. That's not a problem. But you don't want to have legitimate means for generating things that violate every possible condition, descriptive condition. Anything like that is wrong. Well, in this case, and it turns out in a great many cases, you can bar this outcome simply by limiting the resources that are available. Now, what are the resources? The resources are elements that are accessible to the operations. So the real condition says limit accessibility, okay? Keep accessibility as small as you can. We already have examples like that we're familiar with. One of them is the phrase impenetrability condition. Okay? If you think about what that condition says, basically it says when you're generating something, you get to a certain unit, a phase, talk about what it is, anything inside the phase is no longer going to be accessible to operations. Okay, that reduces the amount of computational search that's required, but it's a way of limiting accessibility. Okay, it says those things down there aren't accessible anymore. Another example, and this may be the only other example, is minimal search. This is what's often called a third factor property. Third factor, for those of you who are not familiar, comes from the just simple description of the elements that enter into computation, into learning. Say, what enters into acquiring a system is three things: external data, internal structure, and basically laws of nature, which are independent of the system in question. So if you're studying growth of arms, let's say, humans grow arms, not wings, partly because of nutrition to the embryo, and partly, in fact, largely because of internal structure, just genetic determination, and extensively simply because of the way physical laws operate. There's only certain ways that organisms can develop, other ways just aren't possible. You put these together, you account for any kind of growth and development. The same is true of language. There's external data, whatever it is, it's going to determine whether you end up with Tagalog or English. Internal structure, which at least includes merge, more no doubt, but at least that. And in fact, anything that can be explained in terms of that, it does yield a genuine explanation. And then laws of nature. What are the laws of nature? Well, language is a computational system. It's kind of unusual fact. That's rare in organic nature, maybe unique even, aside from counters. But anyway, that's what language is. So among the laws of nature that you would expect would be things like computation, elimination of computational complexity, doing things as simply as possible. Several reasons for that. One of them actually goes back to Galileo again. One of Galileo's precepts was that nature is simple, and it's the task of the scientist to prove it, whether it's falling objects or flight of birds or growth of flowers or whatever. That's a kind of a prescriptive hypothesis. You can't prove it, but it's been extraordinarily successful. In fact, the whole success of the sciences in the last 500 years is based on that. And that's a good enough reason to assume that it works for us too. Reasonable to accept that. There's a general point which just has to do with the nature of explanation. It's just a fact about explanation that the simpler the assumptions, the deeper the explanation. That's just kind of logic. So there's a lot of I should say in the case of language, there's another reason to believe it, which is unique to language. And it has to do with the conditions on evolution of language. We don't know, very little is known about evolution altogether. If you, as I said, to try to really account for the development of any particular trait is very hard, even in simple cases. In sort of the, evolutionary psychology literature, everything looks easy, happened by natural selection, why not, But when you really try to explain something, it turns out to be hard. In the case of cognitive development, it's uniquely hard because you have no fossil records, okay? No tape recordings of people doing whatever they were doing 100,000 years ago. Okay? Furthermore, when you deal with language in particular, it's super hard. With other organic systems, say vision, you have comparative evidence. You can study cats and monkeys, which have essentially the same visual system. And with them, we, rightly or wrongly, allow ourselves to do invasive experiments. So you can stick a neuron into one cell in the striate cortex and see what's happening and so on. And you learn a lot from that. That's how we know about human vision. But in language, you can't do it because there's no other analogous system. It's a unique system. Nothing analogous in the organic world, so there's nothing to test, okay? So it's kind of uniquely hard. And nevertheless, there's some evidence. The evidence, Bob Berwick and I have a book reviewing it. By now, there's better evidence than what we had in the book. There's by now genomic evidence that Homo sapiens began to separate roughly 200,000 years ago. That's when you get the separation of the San people in Africa from the rest. Interestingly, they have unique forms of externalization. These turn out to be essentially all and only the languages that have complex click systems. There are what apparently look like a few exceptions, but they seem to be borrowings or something accidental. There's again, a very interesting paper by Rini Hoibergs on this recently. So what we know, one thing we know pretty convincingly is that roughly around 200,000 years ago, humans began to separate. They shared the faculty of language at the time. So there's no known difference between the faculty of language of the San people and everybody else, Nobody knows any differences, group differences in language capacity. There happens to be a different form of externalization, which suggests, and in fact Rini goes into this in detail in his article, that this particular forms of externalization develop later. As a matter of logic, the internal system had to be there before you can externalize it. That's not debatable. But he suggests there's a gap when the system was there roughly 200,000 years ago and began to be externalized in somewhat different ways later on. When did Homo sapiens appear? Well, here we have reasonably good fossil record, which shows that anatomically modern humans appear roughly at that time, maybe 250,000 years ago, which is essentially nothing in evolutionary time. So it looks as though the language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens, with the faculty of language intact. Another kind of evidence comes from the archaeological record, which gives a lot of information about rich symbolic activity. It turns out that almost the entire rich symbolic activity that anybody's dug up so far is after the appearance of Homo sapiens. Well, rich symbolic activity has been naturally taken to be an indication of the existence of language. Also more complex social structures, burial practices, all sorts of stuff. So putting it all together, it looks plausible that language emerged suddenly in evolutionary time, along with Homo sapiens. Whatever change gave rise to Homo sapiens seems to have brought language along with it, and it apparently hasn't changed since. That's independent reasons to believe that whatever is in there is probably very simple, along with the Galilean precept and the general principle. If you want explanation, you want simplicity. So it makes good sense from many points of view to assume that the relevant laws of nature here are avoiding computational complexity, so computational efficiency. That's what it means to call it a third factor property. Well, one particular case of computational simplicity. Hi, how you doing? What are you doing here? You graduated years ago.
Yes, it's Thursday afternoon.
Go back to Tufts.
Come back here. I'm wondering where you put among the three factors the fact that the computation has to run on neurons.
Neurons?
Yeah.
That's third factor.
Okay.
First of all, it's not necessarily the case. That's a myth. There's a myth that neural nets are what do the computation, but there's pretty good evidence that that's not true. The neural nets just don't have the computational. Pardon?
About real neurons.
What?
I was talking about real neurons.
Real neurons.
Yeah, not computational.
I'm talking about real neurons.
Yeah.
Real neurons may not be the elements that enter into computation. There's by now reasonably strong evidence against that. Randy Gallistle's book with William King is a very good case where he gives strong evidence, Randy, that if you look at neural nets, you simply cannot find the basic elements of essentially Turing machines. You can't find the core kind of computational element that yields computational activity. It's just not there in neural nets. So what he's arguing is that people who've been looking for neural net accounts of computation are like the traditional blind guy who's looking under the lamppost for his lost keys, because even though he lost them across the street, because that's where the light is. So yes, we know something about neural nets, but it happens that what we're looking for is somewhere else. There's a lot more evidence. The speed and the speed and scale of computation is way beyond what neural nets are capable of. And by now there's, including Randy's particular proposal, is that the computation is actually down at the molecular level, having to do with RNA and so on. There are other proposals by not inconsiderable people like Roger Penrose, for example, that the computation is being done by structures that are internal to neurons, which have vastly greater computational capacity. There's chemical processes that go on in the brain that aren't captured by neural nets. So the fact, and it's been known as far back as Helmholtz, that speed of transition of in neurons is just kind of too slow to be doing very much. So it looks like we're going to have to look elsewhere to find the implementation of computational systems. But there's something there, and it's going to be a third factor property, something about the brain, clearly. We talk about this in our book, in fact. So yes, surely we're going to try to relate whatever's going on ultimately down to the level of cells, That's science, to try to reduce everything, okay? So that's all third factor, if you like. But just talking about neural nets is kind of like talking about natural selection. Yeah, I thought you brought up neurons.
Yeah, neurons in the brain.
Something in the brain, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, surely something in the brain is responsible for this, not the foot, let's say. You can amputate your leg, you still have language. Amputate your head, you don't. So yeah, we agree there's something going on in there. It's a tricky question. It's a very hard question, even for simple traits, not just language. Very simple traits. As I said, you look in technical studies of evolution, the phrase that's often used is fiendishly difficult to find the evolutionary basis for even the simplest traits. So to think we're going to suddenly find them for language is a little misleading. There are some interesting ideas. So Angela Friderici's book that came out recently, MIT Press book on the state of the art in neurolinguistics, gives interesting suggestions about what might be involved in the probably small brain change in brain rewiring that led to the appearance of merge or something like it. Closing a certain circuit in the dorsal and ventral connections. It's an interesting proposal, but certainly not going to be trivial. It's a hard problem. Yes, that would be third factor. So now, where was I? He's always been very disruptive ever since he was a student. So it's innate. Maybe I'll just kind of end here and go on next time. But one principle that we're going to expect for many reasons is computational efficiency. Minimal search is the strongest form of computational efficiency. Search as little as possible. And there is a case of restricting accessibility that we're familiar with, which reduces to minimal search. That's the case of successive cyclic movement. So suppose you've taken a WH phrase and you've moved it up to here, and then you've moved it up to here, and you keep going. And suppose both of these, neither of these, let's say, is blocked by the phase impenetrability condition. Suppose that only blocks things here. Well, the next thing that's raised is this one, not that one, okay? We just take that for granted. Nobody talks about it. But if you ask why, it's, again, a minimal search question. Whatever's selecting the operation, and argue about what it is, that goes back to that mystery I mentioned, is going to take this guy, because that's the one it's going to find by minimal search. So we have at least two cases already that we're familiar with of limiting accessibility. One, PIC, which is pretty broad, the other minimal search, which we've just taken for granted. And maybe that exhausts it. But now I think there's a broader general principle which says just restrict resources. That will have a lot of effects. I'll come back to more examples of that next time. There's a temptation at this point to relate restrict resources to something that Ray and I were just talking about, the fact that the brain is just slow. That doesn't work fast, works quite slowly. And there's many domains in which that is the case. So in many ways, the most striking one is vision. If you look at the sensory motor system, the visual system, the cells of the retina are actually responsive to single photons of light. Okay, they give you a maximal amount of information. The brain doesn't want all that information. It just be way overloaded if it ever got that kind of information inside. So whatever the visual system is doing is, the first step it's doing is throwing out almost all the information that's coming from the retina. And apparently every sensory system is like that. The first thing it does is throw away just about everything and try to get down to something limited enough so this slow brain up here can deal with it somehow. That looks very much like a general property of which resource limitation of the kind that says don't do ordinary recursion, but restrict the resources, of which this is some special case. All seems to converge kind of plausibly. We're very familiar with this in the study of language acquisition. So as you all know, an infant acquiring a phonetic system is basically throwing away information. It's throwing away tons of information in the first months of life, and maybe at about 9 months or a year, saying, these are the only things I'm going to pay attention to. And the same thing goes on through the rest of language acquisition. If you look at something like Charles Yang's general approach to language acquisition, where you're just shifting, the child starts with all possible grammars, I languages, and then it changes the probability distribution of them as data comes along, reducing the probability of things that don't have evidence for them so that they become fundamentally invisible. It's also a matter of throwing away lots of information and converging on just a little bit. The development of the brain is constantly losing neurons because you don't want all this junk around. You want just what you need. And resource limitation fits pretty naturally into that system. I think I'll stop here and try to come back to more detailed examples next time. Okay. Unless somebody else wants to disrupt.